Nobody understood why the 11-year-old girl was walking toward the cockpit. Passengers barely glanced up from their phones as the small figure in jeans and a purple hoodie made her way down the narrow aisle of Flight 447. They had no idea that within minutes, both pilots would collapse, leaving Sophia Williams as their only hope above the jagged peaks of the Colorado Rockies. That day, the youngest pilot in aviation history would make her mark on the world. Welcome to Hidden Story, where we uncover the extraordinary courage hiding in the most unexpected places. Before we dive into this incredible story of aviation, family legacy, and a child who defied every limitation, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, and have you ever witnessed a moment when age truly became just a number? And if you believe stories of impossible courage deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us ensure they reach everyone who needs to hear them. The morning of March 15th started like any other for Sophia Skye Williams. The 11-year-old was traveling alone from Denver to Seattle, a routine trip she'd made dozens of times to visit her grandmother. What made Sophia different from other children wasn't immediately obvious to the flight crew of United Flight 447. She carried herself with unusual composure, spoke in measured sentences, and had an almost unnatural calm about flying that seasoned travelers would envy. The Boeing 737-800 lifted off from Denver International Airport at 10:47 a.m., carrying 147 passengers and a crew of 6. Captain Michael Torres, a 23-year veteran with over 15,000 flight hours, was at the controls alongside First Officer Jennifer Walsh, herself an accomplished pilot with 8 years of commercial aviation experience. Neither had any reason to pay special attention to the quiet girl in seat 14A, despite the unusual request she'd made during boarding. "Excuse me," Sophia had said to Captain Torres as he performed his pre-flight walk-around. "Could I possibly visit the cockpit after we reach cruising altitude? My father always said it was important to understand the instruments." Captain Torres had smiled indulgently. Children often asked to see the cockpit, and while post-9/11 regulations had made such visits more complicated, he appreciated young people's interest in aviation. "We'll see what we can do, young lady," he'd replied, not knowing that this conversation would prove more significant than he could ever imagine. Flight 447 climbed steadily into the Colorado morning, the Rocky Mountains spread out below like a geological masterpiece. In seat 14A, Sophia gazed out the window with the practiced eye of someone far older than her years. She mentally noted their altitude. The captain had announced 33,000 feet and estimated their speed based on the ground references below. These weren't the observations of a typical 11-year-old passenger. What none of the crew knew was that Sophia Williams was the daughter of Captain David "Thunder" Williams, one of the most respected flight instructors at the United States Air Force Academy. From the age of 7, Sophia had been learning aviation from one of the best pilots in the military. Her bedroom was filled with aircraft manuals instead of toys, her computer loaded with flight simulation software instead of games, and her summer vacations spent at airfields instead of amusement parks. Captain Williams had recognized something extraordinary in his daughter, an intuitive understanding of flight that couldn't be taught, only nurtured. By age 9, Sophia could perform instrument approaches on sophisticated flight simulators. By 10, she'd logged over 200 hours of simulated flight time. By 11, she understood aviation principles that many private pilots struggled to grasp. But understanding principles in a simulator was vastly different from managing a real emergency at 33,000 feet above the Colorado Rockies. At 11:23 a.m., something went terribly wrong in the cockpit of Flight 447. It started with Captain Torres feeling lightheaded during a routine radio check with Denver Center. He'd experienced similar symptoms once before, years ago during a particularly stressful training exercise, but this felt different, more intense. His vision began to blur slightly, and he found himself having trouble focusing on the instruments. "Jenny," he said to First Officer Walsh, his voice carrying a note of concern that made her look up immediately. "I'm feeling a bit off. Could you take the controls for a moment?" Walsh nodded and assumed control, but within minutes, she too began experiencing similar symptoms. Dizziness, followed by a creeping sense of disorientation that had nothing to do with spatial awareness and everything to do with something being fundamentally wrong. Unknown to either pilot, a microscopic crack in the aircraft's pressurization system was slowly allowing a dangerous mixture of gases to seep into the cockpit, a mechanical failure so rare that most pilots would never encounter it in their entire careers. The symptoms were insidious. Gradual oxygen deprivation combined with trace amounts of carbon monoxide that created a perfect storm of incapacitation. By 11:27 a.m., both pilots were struggling to maintain consciousness. "Mayday, mayday, mayday!" Captain Torres managed to transmit to air traffic control, his words slightly slurred. "United 447, experiencing pilot medical emergency. Both pilots affected." The transmission cut off as Captain Torres slumped forward in his seat, unconscious. 30 seconds later, First Officer Walsh followed, her hand slipping from the controls as the aircraft began a slight but ominous turn toward the mountainous terrain below. In the passenger cabin, Flight Attendant Maria Santos noticed the aircraft's unusual movement and immediately tried to contact the cockpit. When her calls went unanswered, she made a decision that would change everything. She announced over the intercom that they needed anyone with flight experience to come forward immediately. The cabin erupted in confused murmurs as passengers looked around at each other, trying to process what they'd just heard. A few men in business suits stood up, claiming various levels of flying experience. One had a private pilot's license, another claimed to have flown in the military, and a third said he'd watched a lot of aviation documentaries. But it was the small girl in seat 14A who stood up with a calm that silenced the cabin. "I can fly this aircraft," Sophia said, her 11-year-old voice carrying across the airplane with startling authority. "My father is Captain David Williams, United States Air Force. I have 847 hours of simulator time and full instrument training." The cabin fell silent. Maria Santos stared at the child, her mind struggling to process what she'd just heard. An 11-year-old girl claiming she could pilot a commercial airliner? It seemed impossible, insane even. But as Sophia began walking toward the cockpit, something in her demeanor made Maria step aside. This wasn't a child playing pretend. This was someone who moved with purpose, who spoke with precision, who seemed to understand exactly what needed to be done. "My call sign," Sophia said as she approached the cockpit door, using terminology that only someone with real aviation knowledge would know, "is Sky." The cockpit was a scene of terrifying efficiency gone wrong. Both pilots slumped unconscious in their seats, the aircraft flying on autopilot, but slowly drifting off course toward the towering peaks of the Colorado Rockies. Sophia assessed the situation with a clarity that would have impressed veteran pilots. First, she checked both pilots for pulse. Training her father had drilled into her for any emergency situation. Both were alive but completely unresponsive. Second, she examined the aircraft's current status on the primary flight display. Altitude 32,800 feet and slowly descending, airspeed 420 knots, heading 287 degrees, nearly 15 degrees off their intended course. Most importantly, she calculated their position relative to the terrain below. At their current rate of descent and trajectory, they would impact the Rockies in approximately 12 minutes. Sophia slipped into the captain's seat, her feet barely reaching the rudder pedals, and began the most important radio transmission of her young life. "Denver Center, this is United 447 emergency situation. Both pilots are unconscious. This is Sophia Williams, daughter of Captain David Williams, USAF. I am taking control of the aircraft. Request immediate vector to nearest suitable airport and emergency services standing by." The response from air traffic control was immediate and filled with disbelief. "United 447, did you say? A child is flying the aircraft?" "Affirm," Sophia replied, her voice steady as she disengaged the autopilot and took manual control. "I have full instrument training and 847-hour simulator experience, but I need guidance for approach and landing procedures on this aircraft type." What happened next would become legendary in aviation circles. Denver Center immediately patched Captain David Williams into the frequency. When he heard his daughter's voice from 33,000 feet above the Colorado Rockies, the normally unflappable Air Force pilot had to steady himself against his desk. "Sky, this is thunder," he said, using their call signs to maintain professional discipline despite the emotional weight of the moment. "I need you to listen very carefully. First, what are your current engine parameters?" For the next 8 minutes, father and daughter worked together across the radio waves, with Captain Williams providing guidance while Sophia executed a textbook descent toward Denver International Airport. Her responses were precise, her control inputs smooth, and her situational awareness extraordinary. But it wasn't just her father helping. Denver Center had pulled every available expert into their control room. Boeing engineers, United Airlines training captains, and FAA officials all listened as an 11-year-old girl flew a commercial airliner through some of the most challenging airspace in North America. "Sky, you're doing beautifully," her father's voice came through the radio. "Now I need you to configure for approach. Landing gear down, flaps to position 1. Sophia's hands moved over the controls with practiced precision. Every lever, every switch, every button was exactly where her father had taught her they would be. The hundreds of hours in simulators, the countless nights studying aircraft systems, the patient instruction from one of the Air Force's best pilots. It all came together at 15,000 feet above Colorado. As Flight 447 approached Denver International Airport, emergency vehicles lined the runway. News helicopters circled at a safe distance. Air traffic controllers held their breath as they watched an 11-year-old girl attempt what many adult pilots would consider one of the most challenging tasks in aviation. "Sky, you're on final approach," Captain Williams transmitted. "Airspeed 140 knots, sync rate 700 feet per minute. You're looking perfect." In the cabin, passengers had taken their brace positions, but many were watching through the windows as the ground rushed up to meet them. Flight attendant Maria Santos, who had made the critical decision to let Sophia into the cockpit, later said she had never prayed as hard in her entire life. At 12:18 p.m., exactly 51 minutes after both pilots had lost consciousness, Sophia Williams brought United Flight 447 to a perfect touchdown on runway 34R at Denver International Airport. The Boeing 737 rolled smoothly down the centerline as emergency crews raced alongside, ready for any contingency. But there were no contingencies needed. The landing was so smooth that many passengers didn't realize they were on the ground until the aircraft came to a complete stop. As emergency medical teams attended to the unconscious pilots, who would both make full recoveries from their carbon monoxide poisoning, Sophia Williams became the youngest person in aviation history to successfully pilot a commercial airliner. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, news of the Sky Child had spread across the globe. Aviation experts who reviewed the flight data were unanimous in their assessment. Sophia's performance had been flawless. Her control inputs were precise, her radio communications professional, and her decision-making sound. Captain David Williams, watching his daughter emerge from the aircraft to a crowd of emergency responders, reporters, and aviation officials, later said it was the proudest moment of his military career. "I trained her to be a pilot," he told reporters. "I never imagined she'd have to use that training to save 147 lives at age 11. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from Captain Torres and First Officer Walsh, who both sought out Sophia during their recovery. "You didn't just save our lives," Captain Torres told her. "You saved our families, our passengers' families, and proved that heroes come in all ages." The Federal Aviation Administration, in an unprecedented move, issued a special commendation to Sophia Williams, officially recognizing her as the youngest person to successfully pilot a commercial aircraft in an emergency situation. The Boeing company invited her to their training facilities, and the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum requested her flight suit for their collection. But Sophia Williams, the girl who had become Sky in the most literal sense possible, remained remarkably humble about her achievement. "I just did what my father taught me," she told reporters. "He always said that flying isn't about the plane, it's about the heart of the pilot." The story of Sophia Sky Williams didn't end with her emergency landing. It began there, The FAA created new protocols for recognizing and utilizing unconventional but qualified assistance during aviation emergencies. Airlines began discussing how to better identify passengers with flight experience during crisis situations, and flight training programs around the world added Sophia's emergency descent as a case study in calm, precise flying under extraordinary pressure. More importantly, Sophia's story inspired a generation of young people, particularly girls, to pursue aviation careers. Applications to pilot training programs increased by 400% in the months following her flight, with many young applicants specifically citing the Sky Child as their inspiration. Captain David Williams was promoted to Director of Flight Training at the Air Force Academy, largely due to the recognition that his innovative teaching methods had produced such extraordinary results. He established the Sky Williams Flight Scholarship, providing full flight training to young people who demonstrated exceptional aptitude for aviation. As for Sophia herself, she continued her aviation education with the same quiet determination that had characterized her emergency flight. On her 16th birthday, she became the youngest person to receive a private pilot's license in Colorado state history. By 18, she had earned her commercial pilot's license and been accepted to the United States Air Force Academy, following in her father's footsteps but carving her own path through the sky. During her Academy graduation speech, Colonel Sophia "Sky" Williams, now 22 and one of the Air Force's youngest officer candidates, reflected on that day above the Colorado Rockies. "Flying isn't about age or size or what people expect you can't do," she said. "It's about preparation, meeting opportunity, about staying calm when everything around you is falling apart, and about remembering that heroes aren't born, they're trained." The audience of fellow cadets, aviation professionals, and proud family members rose in unanimous applause for the young woman who had proved that sometimes the smallest person in the room can carry the greatest responsibility. If this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button and share it with others. Help us ensure these tales of impossible courage and hidden strength reach the people who need to hear them. Because the most important lessons aren't always learned in classrooms. Sometimes they're learned at 33,000 feet when an 11-year-old girl proves that heroes truly do come in all sizes. Thank you for watching Hidden Story. We'll see you in the next story, where another lesson waits to be learned, another truth waits to be revealed, and another reminder awaits that extraordinary courage often comes from the most unexpected places. The legacy of Sky Williams reminds us that preparation, training, and calm determination can overcome any obstacle, even when that obstacle is a commercial airliner emergency at 33,000 feet above the Rocky Mountains.